After October 7th, as many of us know, the horrific rapes against Israeli women were part of what we called before the Great Silence. There was very little condemnation, particularly of this aspect of the massacre. It took the UN, there was a senior official from the UN who conducted a study in January, February, and it was only in March that she announced to the Security Council that there were reasonable grounds to believe that there was sexually related violence. There were very few condemnations. There was, I think that for most, the most terrible point from a feminist theory was Judith Butler, who said that who called the massacre acts of armed resistance against state violence. She said, we can have a debate about whether we think it's right. It was not a terrorist attack, and it's not an anti-Semitic attack. It was an attack against Israelis. And there, the question is, was feminist theory betrayed by Judith Butler? We also have seen multiplication of the use of Holocaust analogies since October 7th. Immediately they were there, and everyone who said it's time to put the Holocaust behind us, I think we sadly saw that it's not at all behind us. And as many of you have seen, there's slogans in university walls, on the streets, one genocide is enough, Jews to the gas. I mean, they've become almost commonplace, expressions like this. Comparison, Masha Gessen, another leading public intellectual who compared the Gaza Strip to the Warsaw Ghetto, the president of Colombia, who talked about, he was the president of Colombia who called Gaza the Warsaw Ghetto. Masha Gessen said Gaza Strip was like the Jewish ghetto of the Nazis. I mean, we're full of Holocaust analogies and distortion. We're very pleased to have two wonderful experts to discuss this with us. First, we'll hear from Karin Stögner, who's professor for sociology at the University of Passau and a founder and spokesperson for the working group Antisemitism within the German Society for Sociology. And she's extremely well known, I know, to many of you for her research on anti-Semitism on points of critical theory, intersectionality, and feminist theory. And Philip Spencer is Professor Emeritus of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Kingston College. He's a senior research fellow at the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. And as many of you also know, he's a renowned scholar with work focusing on studies of genocide and modern anti-Semitism. And we'll hear first from some thoughts from each of them, and then we'll discuss it among each other.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for organizing this conference, to all those who are involved. It's a wonderful event, and I'm really happy to be here and be able to speak to you on the topic that Deirdre already outlined a little bit. It's about, actually I want to talk about feminist critical theory after anti-Semitism after 7 October. And what stands out, Deirdre already mentioned it, is that many feminists, particularly intersectional feminists and gender activists today, are among those who willfully deny anti-Semitism, adopt a rigidly and one-sided anti-Israel stance, and even go so far as to legitimize Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or non-Islamist Palestinian terror groups like the PFLP. And I think we have all witnessed this, or many of us have witnessed this after 7 October particularly, but I think this is not self-explanatory. And I want to ask what happened? What happened to feminism? What happened to feminist activism and feminist theory that has allowed the atrocities committed by Hamas to be excused or even legitimized? And this, I believe, is one of the most urgent questions we as feminists, and I'm speaking from a feminist standpoint myself, from a critical theory feminist standpoint, and I think this question is one of the most urgent ones that we must ask ourselves. So my aim is to offer a rescuing critique of feminism in the sense of critical theory. And I will focus particularly on intersectional feminism. One of the central demands of intersectional feminism is to consider forms of oppression beyond those based on gender and sexuality. And this demand stems from the recognition that women are not a homogeneous group, but belong to diverse cultures, to religions, to regions, social strata, economic classes, and so on. And this emphasis on diversity has been valuable, particularly because it criticized and made visible that the universal asserted itself against the particulars. And this critique of the universal as repressive against the particular was articulated already in the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. But it was done with the intention not to discard the idea of universalism and the universal altogether, but instead to find ways of thinking the universal in mediation with the particular. So it was the aim to enable solidarity across narrow boundaries, narrow identity boundaries. In most strands of intersectional feminism, however, the idea of the universal has been dismissed altogether, and I think this is one of the major problems that we need to deal with, so that little room is left for shared experiences or unifying principles that could sustain the demand for feminist emancipation across ethnic, cultural, class, or religious boundaries. There has emerged a fragmented understanding of women's interest. Increasingly, the demand for women's emancipation in the Global South is not directed against patriarchal or sexist structures within the communities and societies in the Global South, but this demand for emancipation is targeted against the influence of Western liberal concepts, and this influence is called West toxification. So we see that this is a quite narrow understanding of the West as uniquely narrow, as uniquely toxic. And this perspective, also the demand for equal rights and sexual self-determination, may be considered toxic if it contradicts cultural or religious norms. For example, Joseph Mossad from Columbia University, who legitimized the Hamas after 7 October, he wrote a couple of years ago that homosexuality would be a Western idea connected to the compulsion of identity, which would be alien to the Islamic world. So, homosexuality and LGBT in the West, in the Western sense, is seen as something that the West would introduce to the Islamic world in order to disrupt Islamic gender relations. Similarly, the Palestinian activist Hanin Maiki considers the women's rights discourse, I quote, anti-revolutionary as it relies too much on notions of tolerance, equality, and normality, end of quote. So there was a complaint in intersectionality that the class aspect was pushed into the background, that it's all about gender and that it's all about ethnicity in identity politics. But now we see that even gender and sexuality issues are more and more pushed into the background, while culture and religion are increasingly emphasized as primary concerns. Women's rights in this context become a secondary issue overshadowed by religion and culture. And this stands in stark contrast to the importance that the Hamas itself is laying on gender relations. So in the Hamas Covenant, in the Hamas Charter from 1988, we read that Islamic gender relations are the foundation of any Islamic community and must be protected against westernization and against Zionist manipulation of Muslim women. Thus, in my view, one of the main problems is that intersectional feminism has lost its unifying goal of liberating women from patriarchal oppression on a global scale. The common goal was replaced by a common foe, in this case Israel and the West in general, that now fill the ideological void left by the erosion of feminist solidarity. And we heard already today about the very close connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Western resentment, also within Islam. From this point, it becomes clear what happened to feminism and to feminist theory and to feminist activism. Intersectionality once emphasized that women were subordinated not only due to gender, but also due to race and class. But intersectionality was not only an academic discourse, but a broad political struggle. And in this struggle, gender eventually lost out to religion and culture, both of which are used by patriarchal powers to keep women in their place and demonize any sexuality that deviates from the repressive heteronormative gender regime. Furthermore, the loss of feminist consciousness due to cultural relativism inevitably creates an opening for anti-Semitism as an outlet. This is exactly what we witnessed after October 7. It is necessary to ignore the anti-feminism and sexism of Hamas in order also to deny the anti-Semitism and reinterpret the Hamas atrocities as a legitimate resistance against a purported colonial power. Once Israel is destroyed, all other problems will be solved. Also the sexism and homophobia in Palestinian society. So we see that this is a mutual distortion of perception. So we see that anti-Semitism and anti-feminism in this sense is seen as a legitimate outcry of the oppressed in the global south. And what Volker Weiss already yesterday called a political theology. We see a massive desire of redemption, a massive desire for redemption on the part of Western activists. So, but I don't want to end with this very quite negative perspective. I want to ask, what can we do about it? What can be done? Is there anything that we can offer? And I think we can. First of all, I think we need to reclaim intersectionality. And I'm not getting tired to reclaiming intersectionality in the sense that we need to start intersectionality from thinking from anti-Semitism itself. So to see anti-Semitism itself as an intersectional ideology, to frame intersectionality not in terms of identity politics, but to frame it in terms of ideology critique, to see how ideologies are so closely and so densely interrelated that the one is indeed within the other, that we cannot actually analyze anti-Semitism without also focusing on how many moments of homophobia and of sexism and of transphobia also, and of anti-feminism is operative in anti-Semitism. And we see this very clearly in the Hamas attacks, in the Hamas atrocities. So this is the one thing that I would demand, to reclaim intersectionality as a tool for emancipatory ideology critique. But also, I think we should try to create a non-cultural relativist post-colonial theory that is critical of anti-Semitism, anti-feminism, and racism. And I think one of the most urgent questions is how to escape cultural relativism without falling into the trap of false universals. In short, how can we rescue a feminist emancipatory universalism that takes its starting point from women suffering from sexist oppression globally, while still being mindful of pluralism? And I think that here again, critical theory can be helpful in, for example, applying the concept of immanent critique to the critique of culture. Immanent critique, as you might know, seeks the standard of critique in the very phenomenon that is being criticized itself. This means that it traces resistant moments in the society or the culture that is being criticized, rather than applying the standard or the norm of critique from outside. This method can be applied for a feminist critique in cultures of the Global South, because it is demanded by post-colonialism. It claims that critique must be based on local ideas in the Global South. Anything else would be a neo-colonialist act. And I think we can do something with this. We can think with this, but critically, because these local ideas are themselves not homogeneous, but may contain moments of resistance to local traditions of patriarchal domination and repression, which we can make visible through immanent critique. Cultures and societies are generally characterized not only by domination, but also by resistance to domination. This is true not only of Western societies, but also of those societies in the Global South. And this, of course, can lead to new forms of domination and oppression, but also can it lead to new forms of freedom. So this process is not predetermined in no case. The dialectic of the historical process is indeed universal. For example, the culture of Iran is not only that of the mullahs, but the culture of Iran is also that of the women and men who rebel against the mullahs and fight for something different. Culture is not a homogeneous identity that is always determined only and exclusively by those in power. A feminist political judgment, I think, must focus on resisting moments and on contradiction in culture. So feminist judgment is not about orienting ourselves towards cultures, but towards the people who live in these cultures, who suffer and struggle in these cultures, and who also shape these cultures in a resistant manner. So I think that from this point of view, we should try to design or ground on this reformulation of a post-colonial theory that is that does not end up in cultural relativism, and that does not, after all, legitimize anti-feminism, sexism, homophobia, or anti-feminism. Thank you for now.
Gosh, I've got to follow that. Well, first of all, my apologies for not speaking in German. It turns out my German is not quite as bad as I thought it was, and they very kindly provided me with a magnificent interpreter for some of this, so please excuse my apologies anyway. Thank you, Deirdre, for inviting me. Thank you, Tikvah, for inviting me. It's been an extremely interesting day. And evening last night, I've been scribbling away furiously, changing my talk every 5 minutes, trying to weave in bits and pieces. I don't think very successfully, but we'll see. If you'll forgive me, I just want to spend a couple of minutes just about personal matters. I've been very preoccupied by the question of genocide now for about 30 years. Prior to that, I was heavily involved in radical left-wing politics for the previous umpteen years. I'm old. And especially Rwanda and Yugoslavia transformed my life politically, ethically, and very personally. So I've spent the last 30 years, teaching about genocide, writing about genocide, and campaigning about genocide. I've been on more demonstrations than you've had hot dinners, and nobody's ever on them until now. All of a sudden, there are mass demonstrations about genocide. There weren't any about Rwanda, there weren't any about Darfur, there weren't any about the Yazidis. I could go on. But now it's the big question. And I find this incredibly shocking, personally. Appalling and disgusting, actually. I know one shouldn't use words like this in an academic conference, but I do. For me, genocide is a matter of absolutely fundamental moral concern. It is the crime of crimes. There are lots of crimes, but this one is at the top, as far as I'm concerned. And we owe the concept to a Jew, to Raphael Lemkin, who formulated this concept because of what he saw happening in the Holocaust. These are not disconnected matters. And because of Lemkin's efforts, particularly his, not only his, we ended up with a Genocide Convention which was passed in 1948, in December 1948, 24 hours before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And for me, this is a huge step forward in the history of humanity, that we have now named this terrible crime and are theoretically committed to stopping it happening. Right? What is this crime? It's not confined to the Holocaust. It could have been. They could have passed a convention that said anything like the Holocaust we have to stop. But they didn't. They went further. And they included other groups. And there are lots of ways in which it was an even bolder decision, and a tremendous decision, in my view. And we have to protect this concept, and we have to protect the convention, and the abuse and the misuse of this concept by anti-Semites is a catastrophe, a disaster, and a scandal. What does the convention say? You can look it up, it takes 5 seconds. It is about the intent to destroy a group. And it lists a series of acts with that intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. Now, this is, and I'll pick up on what Karin was saying here, a universalist stance, because it's an attempt to protect a particular group, but also all of us, humanity itself, because humanity is essentially diverse. If you attack a group, you attack humanity, because, to take the Nazi case, if they'd been successful and eliminated the Jews, annihilated the Jews, destroyed the Jews entirely, humanity would not be the same. So the defense of a group from the intent to destroy it and the acts are a defense of all of us. So, what is going on now? Well, what is going on now is that there has been, and there was, on October the 7th, a genocidal project by Hamas. It's more than a pogrom. The aim was to kill Jews as a group, as many as they could, in whole or in part. It's a genocidal project openly declared for years and shared by others, by Hezbollah and by Iran, for example. And it led on October the 7th to a set of acts which were informed by that intent and were genocidal, and deliberately echoed the Holocaust. The trauma of those acts inflicted on Jews were filmed and disseminated, but also denied at the same time. And that is not unusual in the history of genocide. Now, when this happened, I assumed that the world would react by denouncing a genocidal project and genocidal acts. Astonishingly, exactly the opposite happened. The charge of genocide was not levied against the perpetrators, but against the victims, against Israel, against Jews. Now, it's not the first time in history, in recent history, since the Holocaust, that the charge of genocide has been used against Jews. If you want to trace this disgusting story back, you can go back to the 1970s, or even further if you want to. But now it is coming from purported genocide scholars. Now, genocide studies was actually the creation largely of Jewish scholars, following Lemkin, who invented the concept of genocide. And now it is being turned against Jews, and indeed, in some of the literature, against those very scholars, even though they're now dead and cannot respond to the calumny against them. When I first saw this charge appearing in print, in the newspaper that an old friend of mine called his daily newspaper of choice, The Guardian, I thought, well, okay, it's in The Guardian. They publish stupid stuff. That's life, okay? That was both naive and optimistic of me, among the many mistakes I've made in my life. There aren't that many genocide scholars who subscribe to this, but there have been some influential ones. And I'm not going to name names here because I'll probably get sued. But let me give you a couple of examples. You don't have to look very far to see who they were. There's one who has compared the actions of the IDF to the Wehrmacht, even though he's a historian of the Wehrmacht, and as a historian is concerned with the specificity and the context of an event. That historian said nothing in his charge of genocide about Hamas as a genocidal organization at all. Now, in what conceptual framework is it possible for this upside-down view of the world to take place? And it's a very dizzying and alarming development because it has involved the transformation both of genocide studies and of Holocaust studies. Inside a framework, and I know there's going to be a session on this tomorrow, which we have to identify as post-colonial or settler colonial theory. With regard to the Holocaust, it has led to a downgrading of the centrality of anti-Semitism in the Holocaust, a presentation of the Holocaust as somehow connected to German imperialism, and most importantly, as not so exceptional, but the Holocaust as part of a much wider and longer history of primarily Western imperialism. I'm not going to go into the absurdity of that argument here, just to note it. With regard to genocide, there is now a growing tendency, an alarming tendency in my view, to identify genocide as the product of settler colonialism. A prominent theorist of settler colonialism describes settler colonialism as inherently genocidal because genocide is part of a structure, it's not an event. This is such a flawed understanding of genocide, I haven't got time to go into it. But it's linked to and produced an understanding of Israel as a settler colonial state, and therefore inherently, necessarily, essentially genocidal. This is a lunatic idea, for at least the following reasons, very briefly. Israel is not empire building. Jews were not sent out from the Western metropolis to build an empire. They were refugees fleeing pogroms, persecution, and violence. Jews, of course, are indigenous to that part of the world. They haven't exploited indigenous people, and they certainly haven't annihilated indigenous people. You only have to look at the figures. This is the most unsuccessful genocide in the history of the world. So what we have here is a completely upside-down view of the world. Its ideology, and I come from the radical left, in the way that, in at least one of the senses in which Marx understood it, it flips the world upside down. What looks to be the top is the bottom, what looks to be the bottom is the top. But it presents itself as radical, as subversive, as progressive. Now, it's not the first time in the history of anti-Semitism on the left that a section of the left has toyed with, colluded with, collapsed into anti-Semitism. I wrote a book, any of you who have a problem suffering from sleeping, I can recommend it, on anti-Semitism and the left and the return of the Jewish question with my late and lamented colleague Robert Fine. And we trace the history of anti-Semitism on the left, back to the Enlightenment, through Proudhon, Bakunin, the socialism of fools, and Stalinism. And what characterizes this collapse, this temptation, is the idea that it's the Jews who are responsible for things not going the way we want. It's Jews who are the obstacle to progress. It's Jews, and you can see this most clearly in the Soviet Union, in the Stalinist period, who are the enemies of universalism. They're the ones who are stopping us achieving what we want for the world. Now, the new version of this, because in the 1930s, for example, it was the Soviet Union, the motherland or the fatherland of the working class. Now, in the new version, it's Palestine, which is the solution, which is the universal. Palestine will make us all free. It's now the global south, it's now the post-colonial version of this theory. There are several problems of this, but from the point of view of genocide studies, an awful lot of genocides have taken place committed by post-colonial states, as a matter of fact, since the convention was passed. And again, if you need help with your sleeping, I've written a book about that too. Right. But the charge of genocide is so powerful here. It's not a side issue, and it involves the corruption, the degeneration of genocide studies in a disastrous way, which has moral, intellectual, and political consequences. And in particular, the way the charge of genocide has become a weapon in the hands of anti-Semites, and a way of anti-Semites thinking they are virtuous in attacking Jews. Sometimes I think, imagine what Raphael Lemkin would make of this. A man who died in obscure poverty, having devoted his life to developing the concept of genocide, because of what was done to Jews. But he had a broad concern, not just for Jews, but for others. And now he would have to witness his own idea, to which he devoted his life, being turned against Jews, as the Holocaust itself is being turned against Jews. So that the Holocaust, we're now told, is a barrier. It stops us recognizing other genocides. But of course, Lemkin and his followers used the Holocaust to inspire them to think about not only what was done to Jews, but to others. So this is a dramatic transvaluation, a turning upside down of the most fundamental ideas. And anti-Semitism is central to this. The re-articulation of anti-Semitism in this new way is absolutely central to it. Now, it raises lots of questions, which I haven't got time to answer, and I'm sure you'll pile at me in a minute. But what I would say, and I'll try and finish in a moment, is that using the term genocide to attack Israel, for anti-Semites to feel proud and virtuous and excited about this. And I can tell you I've witnessed excitement firsthand. However bad you think it is here, come to London, right? You go to London on a weekend and you are surrounded by people on the streets chanting, genocide, genocide, genocide against Israel. What is this excitement? What makes people feel so virtuous? I was listening earlier this afternoon to a rather brilliant session. Is this all going to be filmed and transcribed? Because I would really like other people to listen, especially to that session where there was a discussion about the social psychology, which I thought was really wonderful. I don't know if any of those of you are here, but I was really bowled over by it. And what I will now say will be absolutely trivial in comparison to that discussion. But I do want to highlight some things. It's not possible, and here again I want to connect with Karin's view of critical theory. It's not possible to understand the excitement, the virtue signaling, the narcissism of all of this without thinking psychoanalytically about it. And in particular, I would say, what is happening in the turning of this upside down is something profoundly perverse. And there is something attractive about the perverse. There is also the relief of guilt. Many years ago, I think it was an Israeli psychoanalyst who said, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. As my daughter said to me once, not just the Germans, Dad. So I think there is the relief of guilt. I also think there's the attraction of the violence. The celebration of Hamas is exciting to people. When you see on the streets of London people brandishing Hamas slogans and those insignia, you can see they are thrilled by the violence, by the sadism of Hamas. And then there is the projection. And lastly, I don't think this came up so much in the earlier session, I would say there is something exciting about the breaking of a taboo. That for a long time, the Holocaust was there as a kind of taboo. It's been weakening for a long time, but now it's gone. I'll shut up in a minute. Just a couple of further points, if I may. Yeah. Where does this leave us? And I am not sure. I'm torn between optimism and pessimism. I'm a fundamentally politically optimistic person. I'm not so optimistic in other areas, but I'm politically optimistic. I'm pessimistic because I think this has a long way to go. There is a lot of mileage in it. There is a lot of excitement and attraction to it. And I also think, and this is part of the importance of the concept of genocide, it is a global phenomenon. It's not confined to Germany. It's not confined to the Middle East. It's not confined to Western Europe. It's not confined to North America. It's everywhere. I mean, Australia, for goodness sake, how far away from the Middle East do you have to get, right? It's in Australia too. So I think this has a dynamic and a momentum that is hard to see when exactly it will stop. I think it will stop. I think it will run out of steam. And my optimism about this, which may be utterly misplaced, and people will probably tell me afterwards that you're an idiot, is that I think this is a completely incoherent view of the world. It is a contradictory view of the world, which denies significant realities and has to turn things around, and therefore it is unstable. But I also think that it is profoundly reactionary. It's taking us back to an earlier period, and I think the whole settler colonial theory is deeply reactionary in lots of ways. So I don't think it will survive, but I think we have to fight hard to protect what is being vandalized. We have to protect the concept of genocide. We have to defend the meaning of the Genocide Convention. We cannot afford to let this crucial moral and political concept and law be not just misused, not just abused, but squandered. That is our obligation. Thank you.
Among the many levels of the analysis of both of you, one of the things that struck me are the contradictions in the tension between universality and particularism, which is an old struggle. It's nothing new. In Jewish culture, this fight has been going on at the latest since the emancipation, but even earlier, if we look into our Talmudic writings. And there's some contradictions, in a way, in some of the things you were saying about, Karin, you were talking about how universality is now being used as a repressive concept against women. And I think I'd like to ask you to explain it a bit more, because you're also talking about this tension and the difficulties of fighting against the hijacking, basically, of critical feminist theory, what it has to do with it. And then, Philip, you were talking about the way in which the universality of the genocide concept, based on the particular, is now being inverted. So I think if each of you could talk more about that aspect.
Well, I also think that the universalism particular dynamic, the dialectical dynamic between the universal and the particular is so central to anti-Semitism. And I remember Robert Fine, our late friend and colleague, once saying to me that anti-Semitism can actually accuse the Jews of anything, be it the universal or be it the particular. And it does not, it's not about the Jews. Jews don't count, as David Bedell also wrote. But it's all about the anti-Semites. And it's all about the mindset and the particular needs of anti-Semites at a particular given time. So, and this might diverge. It's not always the same. But what is particular to anti-Semitism is that it can kind of integrate all these needs. And that anti-Semitism is what Freud called Schiefheilung. And I don't really know that word in English, Schiefheilung. Well, it's a distorted healing. Yes, so it's a healing, a collective healing that is distorted, and distorted. Yeah. Is that right? Discorded. Okay, discorded. But this is a German-speaking audience, so Schiefheilung, you will understand what I mean anyway. No, but what actually needs to be schief geheilt? What is it? And I think what today, and this is becoming particularly evident after 7 October, we're living in a time where we see a new discomfort in culture, a new Unbehagen in der Kultur. And I want to follow up what Philip said about the need and the necessity to think also in psychoanalytical terms, and that it is necessary in order to understand what we are all talking about and what we are witnessing to also think about it in psychoanalytical terms. And I'm emphasizing the word also, because I would not want to reduce it to psychoanalysis. because the reason is a social one. We may not, or I as a sociologist, don't want to lay the reason or the motives for this Schiefheilung into the individual, but rather focus on the very complex relationship between society and the individual. So I think that we have got to do with a particular kind of social isolation that people are feeling, experiencing today, but not experiencing consciously, and they are not feeling it concretely, but very abstractly. And this is also what anti-Semitism is about, as Samuel Salzborn, our colleague from Berlin, once very aptly said that anti-Semitism is about the inability to feel concretely and to think abstractly. So anti-Semitism, very much of the emotions and of the excitement that Philip was talking about, that's kind of an abstract emotion, I would say. I think that anti-Semitism is an outlet for this inability to feel concretely also today, and in this negative identification with Israel in the genocide claim, we also see this desire for authenticity that is so hardly felt. This desire, but again, not consciously felt. So this discomfort with in culture, I think this is really a very important thing, and this is also connected to queer theory, for example. And why is queer theory, or why are queer theorists so prone to propagating an anti-Semitism? And I think this discomfort in culture, in queer theory, is a special thing. Because it is a discomfort with bodily existence in general. It tries to, or it wants to get across all barriers. Barriers should be, all boundaries should be overcome, and also the bodily boundaries shall be overcome. And this is why Shakespeare. So, I mean, there is something really important to queer theory in the sense that it questions the identity compulsion that we are all suffering from in our modern societies. But it can get mad, and it has gone mad, particularly when we view the feminist queer theorist Shakespeare, who would say that the epitome of queer is the suicide bomber. So there is nothing that can manifest the nihilism that is in queer theory, the nihilism concerning the own bodily existence and the whole contradiction that's connected to the bodily existence, and the ambivalences, all the ambivalences that are in this bodily existence and that we need to cope with. And this is difficult, of course, but we have no other way out. We need to cope with it. And one negative, very negative way of coping with it is that queer theory gone mad. And I wouldn't say that queer theory is crap altogether, but only this mad forms of it. But I think I should stop at this point and hand over to Philip.
Hello? Okay, that's better. Thank you. Okay, I don't think it's a contradiction between the universal and the particular. I think you have to hold both of those concepts in your mind. They go together. There is no real serious universalism which does not include particular elements to it. And in the history of the relationship between universalism and the question of anti-Semitism, I think you can see where the tensions arise, where the problem arises, where the temptation to attack the particular comes in. If you go back, Robert and I trace this back to in terms of the history of anti-Semitism, to the Enlightenment, to two different traditions in the Enlightenment. There was an element in the Enlightenment that saw Jewish particularism as a problem. And it generated a modern form of anti-Semitism. I mean, briefly, the argument was that anti-Semitism was a terrible thing before the Enlightenment, but now we've got the Enlightenment, we don't need Jews to remain on their own, to have any particular identity. But there was always another element in the Enlightenment that understood that Jews would contribute to the universal with their particular culture, with their identity, and so forth. Now, this connects for me to the idea, to the importance of the Genocide Convention being understood as the protection of both the group and humanity itself. Because humanity, I said this before, it's not my idea. You can find this in Lemkin, you can find this in Hannah Arendt at the time. This is what they were thinking about. That the groups are, the humanity is made up of groups, not, to be clear, in any reified or essentialist way. I completely agree with Karin's conception of culture, right? There isn't a fixed, given culture. People create culture all the time. That's what makes life so exciting and so interesting. But when a group is attacked, all of their cultural contribution to humanity is also being attacked. That's what makes, it's the diversity of humanity that makes it so rich. This was Lemkin's, he didn't have a perfect understanding of culture, but we can understand this in a much more creative and productive way. Now, what is going on when you get the development of a form of universalism, and it's a recurring temptation, right? I referenced the Stalinist version of this. When one particular group is identified as the enemy of the universal. What is happening, and there are absolutely, Karin is right, important material reasons, contextual reasons why this is happening, because it is actually the failure of the universalist project that is generating the need to attack a group. You could see this most clearly in the Soviet Union, but it happens all over the place, right? What is happening here is that all of the problems of society, right, are being projected onto the group. And I would make just one additional point about critical theory here, right? When I started working on this, I went back to reading Adorno and Horkheimer. Now, I know that all of you Germans are brought up reading this. It's not true, unfortunately, in the United Kingdom, right? I went back and read it. I went back and read in particular the correspondence between Adorno and Horkheimer as Nazi anti-Semitism was developing. And it's really, really interesting stuff because they changed their mind. They understood how dangerous anti-Semitism was. They didn't see it. Amazingly, they didn't see it. They actually had quite a crude and reductive and instrumental understanding of it. But if you read their correspondence, they're coming to understand 1940, 1941, 1942, how incredibly dangerous and destructive anti-Semitism is again, both for Jews and for everybody. I can't remember which one of them said it in the letter. Whoever aims at the Jews aims at humanity itself.